Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another season of Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. I'm pleased to note that Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. Every week, it seems, we hear reports of striking new developments in the world of espionage and intelligence. Last summer, after years of on-the-ground espionage, the U.S. successfully invaded a walled compound in Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden. In the effort to curb terrorism, we learned that an American pilotless drone aircraft successfully attacked and killed a U.S. citizen who was preaching anti-American rhetoric in Yemen. But we also learned that someone, somewhere, has successfully used computer technology to attack the Defense Department's computers and to infiltrate other systems in the U.S. And we learned that a mysterious virus, a computer virus, or something called Stuxnet, was used by someone to screw up Iran's attempts to build nuclear explosives, perfectly in line with U.S. policy to stop the Iranian effort. And we see occasional satellite photos of Iran and North Korea's nuclear sites, which the U.S. also wants to stop. Today's world of spies, lies, and sneaky guys is very different from the espionage and intelligence world just a decade ago, and certainly different from the Cold War world where Soviet and American spies battled in the dark alleys of Berlin and Moscow. Our speaker tonight, Dana Priest of the Washington Post, has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for her investigative journalism covering national security and intelligence. She's written extensively about the CIA's covert counterterrorism operations around the world, the agency's secret rendition and detention practices, the intelligence lapses following the September 11th plot, and the failure of pre-war intelligence in Iraq. Her 2006 Pulitzer honored her disclosure of secret CIA prisons abroad, where American rules of conduct were not in effect. Her second Pulitzer came after she helped reveal such terrible conditions for wounded American troops returning from Iraq and Afghanistan at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington that the hospital's top military staff was removed and the entire hospital was eventually shut down. Dana Priest has won numerous other awards. I won't detail them now. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Please welcome Dana Priest to the University of Delaware.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and I'm so glad to be here. My talk is titled The Military Intelligence Complex, which for those of you my age or older will remember comes from, is a takeoff on the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. And when I was writing about this, I wanted to name it something new, and nothing really stuck. So if any of you have an idea, I'm still open. But we came up with, one of them that we came up with was Defense Intelligence Enterprise, but the acronym was DIE. So we figured that wouldn't work. And we came up then with, well, how about the Defense Intelligence Complex? And we figured, no, that wouldn't work either. So we're still searching. I actually love this title, Spies, Lies, and Sneaky Guys. At first, I'm a little paranoid. I thought, I'm the sneaky guy? But, and yes, it has happened that you have to sort of use the CIA's tradecraft against itself to get information, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to start my story here on 9/11 because really the world changed in so many ways, and the military intelligence complex that grew up after 9/11 is a particular focus of mine. So on 9/11, I was sitting not in the center of any kind of action at all. I was up in my attic at home on book leave, writing a book about the growing influence of the military in non-military affairs, and I was trying to explain how that had all come about under the Clinton administration. In the interregnum, or at that time it was just the lull after the end of the Cold War, the largely peacetime that we were in. And my editor called me up, the top editor of the Washington Post, and said, "Do you know what happened?" And I didn't have a clue what he was talking about, and he told me about the strikes. And I came downtown as everyone else was leaving town, came into the newsroom and tried to help out. And for the first year, most reporters in my position were really concerned mainly about writing, trying to figure out who was this organization that had now attacked us, Al-Qaeda. And we were also concerned about the US government's role in not unearthing the plot, despite the many resources that we had given it over the years. How had the CIA and the FBI in particular failed to know that this was coming? What we didn't know at the time, in fact, we didn't know much of anything. It's hard to think back on that time, but really in the in the year following 9/11, we got very little information about what was happening. When a war was eventually launched in Afghanistan, we couldn't pose and answer the simplest questions that we had been able to impose and ask before, like, well, how are we fighting this war? What weapons are we using? What tactics, military tactics, are we using? And are those tactics going to get us to the strategic end that we are wanting to achieve, which is the defeat of terrorism? And one of the reasons that we couldn't get to that is that unlike a regular war, a conventional war, all of that information was classified. Because the government was basically in a panic mode after 9/11, not knowing but thinking we would be attacked soon again, everything that the US did in response was put behind this thick wall of classification, which made it very difficult for us to get any information out about what was happening. What we discovered later that was happening was that several days after 9/11, President Bush signed what's called a presidential finding that approves a covert action plan for the CIA. Covert action being those actions that are designed never to show the hand of the US government. So they are the most secretive of secrets. And he signed a wide-ranging presidential finding that basically said, use all means necessary to kill or capture or otherwise neutralize the people involved in 9/11 and the people that supported them in various ways, financially or giving them safe haven. It was very broadly based. We didn't know that at the time, but what it set in motion was the largest covert operation in the nation's history, larger, say, people within the CIA than anything we undertook during World War II even, and during the Cold War. It was codenamed Greystone, and it had elements that, when we learned later, were of great surprise and significance. For instance, it had a whole regime of secret airplanes helping fly around the world suspected terrorists who were being put into secret CIA prisons around the world, which had never existed before 9/11, and who were being interrogated using rules that never existed before 9/11 and techniques that never existed before then, because the CIA basically had been out of the interrogation business for a whole generation of operatives. And when they decided that they needed to be interrogators, because really there were hardly anybody else around to do it, and they didn't want the FBI doing it, who did have experience in that sort of thing, they put together groups of psychologists that worked for the CIA and polygraphers, people who, put people under polygraph to see if they were telling the truth, and some contractors to come up with techniques that might work against hardened terrorists. And as we know now, that's where they came up with the idea of waterboarding and some of the other more nefarious techniques that we've since learned about. But the other thing that was happening at the same time to fund all this was Congress. Congress was opening the wallets. Within the first several weeks after 9/11, Congress gave the agencies involved in this global war on terrorism about $40 billion more to do what it thought was best, and several months after that, another $40 billion more. This was more money than the Defense Department was even asking for, and according to members of Congress and to people inside the government at the time, it was more than they knew what to do with. Every idea that anyone had to counter terrorism, no matter whether you knew anything about it, was being funded. And at the same time that it was doing this, because again, I think we were in the panic mode, Congress said, here's a lot of new money, but whatever you do, don't grow government. Because the American people don't like government, and they don't want more federal employees on the rolls. So here's $80 billion more, but don't grow government. Not many other options left, except to hire contractors, to hire people who didn't work for the government, who worked for profit-making companies. I'm not against profit-making companies, but their motives are different than people who get a relatively small or medium income as federal employees. Their motive is also to help their company make a profit. And so we saw, well, we didn't see it at all immediately, but what was happening was a gigantic splurge in hiring people in the private sector or from the private sector, many of whom didn't have a clue what they were doing because they'd never been in the business. And you saw hundreds of companies come online from people who used to be at the CIA or used to be in the military, and they would put together a group to sell analysts or sell interpreters or sell IT people to the government for at least twice as much as the government people were making themselves. But we didn't want to grow government. And at the time, the thought was that these people would be cheaper because you could hire them now, and if you didn't need them next year, you didn't have to keep them. But that, of course, is not what happened at all. What happened was companies realized how much money they could make. And profit margins, even during the recent recession, profit margins among these companies were record-breaking for them. And so you had the large defense contractors like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics actually take a chunk of their business and reroute it from building hardware and legacy weapon systems like ships, aircraft, into selling information, being able to electronically collect information, analyze it, and then sell it back to the government in a form that it might be able to use to target terrorists and do the other things that it needed to do. So all of this covert operation and all of this contractor business, all of it had a giant, what the military calls tail, tooth to tail. So the tooth is the fighting men and women, and the tail is the support systems that allow those people to fight. And in the intelligence world, you had a gigantic difference between those who were on the ground fighting, who tended to be small units, and the logistics that it took to get them there. So you're talking about, when you're talking about a covert operation, you're talking about cover names and fake businesses and an increase in the number of people and new aircraft that they had to buy or lease and new interrogators that they had to buy and lease or interpreters. And so you had just the blossoming of the contractor arena. But none of it could be seen because, again, it was all classified. At about the end of the first year, we started to hear strange things about what was going on the ground. That people with uniforms that didn't have markings were capturing people and putting them into large containers where they were being kept, or they were abusing them on the way to an interrogation center. We even began to hear about the black sites, the secret prisons. And the media, myself included, began to sort of poke around at this, but we didn't get very far. And meanwhile, what was happening is the contractors were making inroads into government that the government itself never thought would happen. There's a rule within the government that says contractors cannot do things that they call inherent government functions. So contractors were meant to supply the computer systems, or the food, or the infrastructure, the actual bases. But they weren't supposed to be firing weapons. They weren't supposed to be involved in covert operations exactly. And yet, this world was allowed to grow with no impediments whatsoever, to the point where today there are several of the 14 different intelligence agencies that couldn't even survive without the contractors. Just to name a couple, the National Reconnaissance Office, one of the most secret organizations in the US government. It manages, builds, and maintains the spy satellites around the world, is so dependent on contractors that it would literally go out of business without them. If you go into the CIA lobby and you see pictures of the white marble and the wall of honor with all the anonymous stars, well, of the 22 stars that represent the people at the CIA who died in the line of duty after 9/11, 8 of them are contractors. So contractors were not doing just the support activities. They are in the heart and soul of what the government actually does in our name in this war on terror. It has gotten so bad that one of the contractor situation that it is costing the government way more than they ever expected, not saving money because these companies are very clever at coming up with new ways and new things the government needs. And Congress has not until this time been very tough about saying, well, give me an indication this will work. And so you've just had an unintended consequence, which is you can make so much money at the intelligence world in the contracting field that you didn't just get the retirees or the older generation who was leaving to come back into contracting, but you got a middle management that you never saw leave the agencies so quickly, to the point that today we have the youngest CIA that we've ever had, the youngest analysis group and the youngest operative group with the least amount of experience. One would argue at a time that we need the most amount of experience. When I interviewed Leon Panetta when he was the CIA director about this contractor issue, he was not shy at all. He said, this really worries me because their allegiance is not necessarily to the government, and I cannot necessarily control them, which I thought was a pretty upfront answer. And this was after the Blackwater security episodes in which armed Blackwater security people had killed many Iraqi civilians. I asked Robert Gates, the defense secretary, about the same issue, about the contracting issue. And he said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but when I asked my staff if I could get a number of contractors working in my personal office, the office of the Secretary of Defense, I couldn't get an answer. And that's because not only were they not only are there so many, but the contractors employ subcontractors that just are not on the government books. And so right now the government is actually trying to figure out how many contractors work for it. This growth caused Congress to say, you know, this thing is getting pretty unwieldy, so let's put somebody in charge. And so they created a whole new bureaucracy to do that, which they called the Director of National Intelligence. And they said, this person will be on top of everyone because it's so big and everybody's so busy, and we need somebody to manage it all to make sure that, you know, there's bottom line responsibility, there's not too much overlap, we're coordinating things, we're talking to each other. So they created the Director of National Intelligence, but they didn't give him the power to be in charge. And the reason was because to do that would mean that certain members of Congress on certain committees that control certain bureaucracies did not want to give up their power. And the Defense Department, under Donald Rumsfeld, a no pushover he, has the largest amount of intelligence agencies underneath it, and he was not going to give up power to a new so-called intelligence czar. But they created it nonetheless, and they put various people in charge. The first one was a diplomat named John Negroponte, and the last one, the one who's today working there, is a retired admiral, a retired Army General, Jim Clapper. So they created this DNI, it's called, and it did, even though it didn't have even the power to hire and fire people, it was supposed to be in charge. So not only didn't have the power to be in charge, it did, nonetheless, it did what most of these bureaucracies that are hidden behind this wall of classification so we can't look at them, it did what a lot of them did, which is it grew. To the point at which, I wish I had a slide to show you, but there is a building in some of the priciest real estate in the Washington area, in McLean, where the DNI is located. It is officially an undisclosed location, and when you drive to it, it doesn't announce itself, it just gives the address. But if you drive, as I did, around the corner and up to the medical building next to it, you can look out over the building and see that it is gigantic. In fact, when I was trying to figure out how big it was, because they wouldn't tell me and they wouldn't tell me how many people worked in it, I found the company that constructed it, and on their website, they proudly announced that the building was 500,000 square feet. And when I finally got an interview there, I took a lot of time driving around the two huge parking structures and counting all the parking spaces, because I figured that related somewhat to the capacity of the building. And indeed, about 2,500 people work there at an agency that, I hate to say this because I know that a lot of those people work very hard and are very dedicated to what they do, but many people in the intelligence world still, to this day, 10 years later, don't know what their real added value is. And Jim Clapper, who's a very experienced intelligence officer, has been all but demoted because he doesn't have the same kind of relationship with the president as others in the intelligence world do, and who President Obama listens to more. So you have this one large bureaucracy built after 9/11, and then you had a second one, which Congress also believed had to be instituted, called the Department of Homeland Security. Now, the same thing sort of goes for them. They are to look at the domestic situation, and they brought together some existing organizations, and then they grew some new offices as well, to the point where there are now about 88,000 people who work at the Department of Homeland Security, And right now they're scattered throughout the city, but they are going to be brought together in a new headquarters that when it is finished will be larger than the Pentagon. And yet, like D&I, the role and the contribution of DHS to finding and stopping terrorists is not exactly clear to a lot of people in the government, principally, I would say, the FBI, who does have a track record of finding more suspected terrorists in the United States than anyone else. When I talk to okay, so the other thing that's happening as well as this growth and the money flow out into industry and out into government is that while everybody is trying to come up with good ideas to solve the terrorism problem, because we don't have experts everywhere, a lot of people come up with some really mediocre ideas that are already being done by a half a dozen organizations. And I have visited countless of these organizations who are working on terrorism, who have really no business working on terrorism because they have no expertise. And so the idea of duplication runs rampant in this area. And one of the reasons it does is because you and I can't say, well, wait a minute. And we can't say that because we can't see what's going on inside, even on the most superficial level, because it's all classified. I wanted to give you, one good example of why duplication matters. So it's like the kids in the soccer ball. Everyone's running after the soccer ball. No one's playing defense, offense. No one's looking ahead. And if everyone's allowed to do that, it's not going to be a very good game. Here it's the same thing, but it has much more dire consequences. And my favorite example of this is an agency that I'm sure one or two of you may have heard of, but most of you haven't. It's called Inscom, which stands for it's the Army's Intelligence and Security Command. It happens to be the largest counterintelligence, in other words, they're looking for spies, they're trying to do bad to us, the largest counterintelligence organization in the country. It is an Army organization, and its main job is to find traitors and spies that want to recruit people in the Army, spies or terrorists now, who want to recruit people in the Army to do bad things. But that is a really hard job to do because you have to approach some very sensitive subjects, Islam and Muslims in the Army being one of them. That is very sensitive for all the right reasons. And so what Inscom did for many years was to say, well, what we really want to do is we want to find terrorists within the United States, so we're going to put together a plan to do that. And their plan, parts of which I saw, looked like they were reinventing the wheel with the most rudimentary analysis. What they were not doing is that job of looking for bad guys within their own ranks. And it just so happened that there was one of them, Major Nadal Hassan, who at Walter Reed Army Hospital, he was a psychiatrist there. Walter Reed is 30 miles away from Inscom. And while he was there, one of the things he did that should have rang some bells is he put together a slide show, and one of the slides said, if you can't figure out a way to let Muslims out of the Army, you're going to see the bad consequences. And he gave other signals to his medical colleagues. And, I don't put the total blame on them because their heads are not into looking for terrorists. They're trying to heal these guys in the hospital, and some of them saw him as a very valuable insight into the Muslim world. He himself was practicing. And Inscom, whose job was to know where people with issues might be, never, ever got wind of him until it was too late, and he killed so many of his colleagues at Fort Hood. And that is the real painful ramification of duplication, when you don't take on the hard job, but you run after the soccer ball. The same could be said for, I have many other examples of this, but, one of the people who was trying to tell me how bad this had gotten took me into the Pentagon one night. I met them in the Pentagon parking lot at night. And we went in through a certain entrance, and I got through all these little vaults and everything, and he took me into the Pentagon, showed me his computer system, and showed me ream after ream after ream of counter-terrorism analysis, just hundreds and hundreds of different products, they call them, different sheets of, from this agency, from that agency, to the point where he literally, screamed, "This is so much information, I can't read it, I can't do anything with it." And so many people were in his same situation. They were being flooded with mediocre information that all looked the same on counterterrorism, to the point that they just said, ugh, I'm not going to read this, I'll get a briefing by my guy. And which is the exact opposite of having the government share information. When I asked Jim Clapper if there was really anybody in charge of all of this very secret information, and did anybody in the government know all the programs that existed throughout the intelligence world, he basically said, only God knows. And I mean, not to beat the dead horse, but this is after all of these reforms, 10 years after 9/11, and the truth was that no one was in charge. No one still really is in charge of counterterrorism, and we have a hard time looking at it. So, onto this theme, I decided with my colleague Bill Arkin, let's see how big this has become. Let's actually try to count the number of secret organizations that the government has and the number of companies that work at the secret level. So secret is a classification. So we started to try to do that, and within a week we said there are so many secret organizations that we couldn't possibly count them all. We're going to have to go to the top secret level, which seems like just one step, but it's actually a huge step. So we're now talking at the top secret level. Information that, if it were to get out, would gravely damage national security. That's the definition of top secret. So we decided, we'll try to count the number of government organizations doing top secret work and what kind they do, and the number of companies doing top secret work and what kind of work they do, and put it into a big database and throw it around in different ways and see if we can count the number of groups that are doing the same things, which we can do, which is on our website called Top Secret America. So how are you going to do this? Well, one of the ways we did this is to use a very secretive tool called monster.com. And if you were to go home and go to monster.com tonight, which is a giant electronic jobs board, and if you were to type in the search engine top secret, you would come up, unless they've changed something recently, I don't think they have, you would come up with at least hundreds of jobs requiring a top secret clearance. And then you could, many of those jobs give a description of what it wants. And some of them give you the code names of the programs that it wants its applicants to be familiar with. Now, it doesn't say what those code names are about, but now we've collected all these code names too. And you can go to another secret website called LinkedIn, and if you were curious about an organization that had a strange budget history and was really a program that was hidden by the Air Force or the Navy, as we did, you might be able to find people who actually put on their resume that they worked for such and such an agency, as we did. So after about a year of this, we did a lot of this sort of database searching, and I, in particular, did a lot of what I would call basic gumshoe reporting, which means I go out to a neighborhood that we know there are some top secret organizations, and I walk around and I collect more addresses, and I would give them to Bill, who's working in his converted barn in Vermont with his gigantic database, and he puts it in his database, and we do cross-referencing, and after a year, we come up with these 1,200 federal organizations at the top secret level, 2,000 private contractors at the top secret level, about 1 million people with top secret clearances, about 300 of which are not government employees, but they're private contractors. So this is a whole new population that is growing and growing. And we have put all of them on a map, because it's not only Google that can geolocate you, but we, using Google and other things, can geolocate all these organizations. So we decided to put it on a map and see what the map told us. And the map told us, what it gave us was like an alternative geography to the United States, where the capital was not Washington, D.C., but 50 miles north of Washington, D.C., around the National Security Agency, which is the nation's eavesdroppers, and whose budget more than doubled after 9/11, and who, no surprise, the contractors wanting to do business with them clustered around 9/11. So much so that driving around that area, you drive through now entire business parks that are filled with companies that do nothing but top secret work for the government and have their own private bridge linking them to the National Security Agency. And it really has become, a whole different top secret world with its own culture, its own ethics, and certainly its own money flow that you and I cannot see. So meanwhile, what is also happening is the war on terror is taking a particular turn, because a lot of the things that were unearthed before were then stopped. There are no more secret prisons. They don't want to put anybody else in Guantanamo because that's too controversial. The use of drones is increasing, and the use of a particular organization called JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. These are the Navy SEALs that killed bin Laden. They are a part of this organization that is it's so secretive that it's officially not disclosed. Officially, JSOC trains and equips other soldiers. But in reality, what it does is it manhunts, and it has been responsible for killing and capturing probably the largest number of terrorists and suspected terrorists throughout the world, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in Yemen and in the Philippines, Somalia, and elsewhere. So we have a second iteration of the secret war going on in the middle of the defense industrial complex. So at about this time, I'm doing a lot of reporting, and I end up in the Boise, Idaho airport because I'm doing reporting on how all of this filters down to the state level, to your lives and my life, and how at the state level, every state has now at least one, but some have many more than one, intelligence fusion center funded by the Department of Homeland Security, whose job is to bring together intelligence, which really means information, but it's cooler if you say intelligence, intelligence from local law enforcement, the sheriff's department, the police, the ambulance people, just whatever, to bring it together and analyze it and look for patterns and look for potential suspicious activities. And what I learned by visiting a couple of them, including one in Boise, and I'll get back to that in a minute, is most of these states don't have enough terrorism to look at, even though they all have a terrorism bulletin now, and they're analyzing trends and patterns, and they're looking for suspicious activity. Most of them don't have enough of that, so a lot of them are using this model to turn on regular old-fashioned crime, which probably is a good thing. But they're also using some of the equipment that originally was sold by companies to the military to take the biometrics of the entire Iraqi population, those same companies are now offering it, because these wars are winding down, to the domestic law enforcement agencies. So you get things like fingerprint scanners. Now in some states, if you're stopped for a traffic violation, the police officer will take out a mobile fingerprint scanner and ask you for your fingerprint. You can say no most of the time, but why would you say no? That goes into a central database. That database is filled not just with the fingerprint, but other records about you, even though you've not ever done anything wrong. But if you were to do something that looks suspicious, like walk in front of a federal building too many times, or take a picture of a dam or a federal building, this is the picture taking can really get you in trouble. You might actually go as a suspicious activity report into this database. And you would sit there in that database, and your information would be fed into an FBI database called Guardian in a secret building in somewhere in the Washington suburbs. And since we don't know if you're a terrorist really, it would sit there until we got more information and we could make a decision. Either you were suspicious, in which case an investigation starts, or you're not suspicious, in which case you just stay there until maybe more information comes in. You know, it's harmless in one way, unless you got a certain leadership that wanted to use it for more nefarious purposes. One of the other byproducts is that you have a lot of local law enforcement taking what I call a dragnet approach to counterterrorism, which is cast the wide net, see what you get. And to this date, nobody in government who defends the system can show me examples of real progress, real terrorists that have been found this way. Most of them are found the old-fashioned way, which is the FBI cultivating informants who can lead them to terrorists or potential terrorists. And you've seen that in the many arrests that have been made recently. But I'm in the Boise, Idaho airport, and I see this woman, Joy Whiteman, who is disabled. She's in a wheelchair. She's 70 years old, and she is going through the the scanner, and she's struggling to get out of her wheelchair because she has to go through the scanner. And she's teetering, and the TSA agents are sort of like this, you know, are you okay? And she said, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. And so I said, I'll go over and interview her, and surely she'll think that this is crazy, you know, how she could be a terrorist. So I go over to interview her. She's got this bright flowered jacket on and clean white tennis shoes. And I say, what do you think about, you know, you in a wheelchair having to get up and go through this? And she said, oh, I don't have a problem with it at all. I could be a terrorist. I thought, maybe. And then she got really serious, and she said, you know, the last time I came through here, they didn't even make me get out of my wheelchair. And she flings open her jacket, and she says, I could have had explosives. And her husband, who's even older, is sitting there, yeah. And it wasn't the reaction that I thought I would get, but it was a really important reaction, because I think that 10 years after this event, we still are not willing to say, what is it that really works? And should we still accept everything? Should we accept the fact that Joy Whiteman has to get out of her wheelchair and go through the scanner, even though scanners have not yet found a single terrorist? Should we accept this unendless spending, even though the government itself will admit, forced to, that some of the programs are not adding value? You know, I get asked all the time, has this made us safer? And I say, absolutely. The fact is that Al-Qaeda is nearly dead. There are a couple hundred left in the world. And yes, there are other organizations that have taken its place or are trying to, but they aren't nearly as strong. And the US government agencies that are the best at what they do know pretty much where they are, where they're moving to, and how they're being financed. So the answer to the question, are we safer, is we are absolutely safer. Not because of this giant military intelligence complex I've just described, but because within it there are some smaller, finely tuned organizations that have made gigantic strides in collecting intelligence largely overseas, but the FBI here, and in being able to bring it together in rapid speed in order to collect it and move on it the same night. And I am talking here about some of those same secretive troops, the same ones that killed bin Laden. I'm talking about the part of the National Security Agency that spied on that compound. I'm talking about the FBI people who know how to recruit informants here and abroad and who do it every day. I am not talking about this giant machine that, you know, part of which has 500,000 square feet in McLean in an undisclosed location. So yes, we are safer, and that's the reason why. And to end, I'll just say that this thing does continue to grow, although not at the rate it was growing before. And if the government decides in this recession to cut back on some of it, you and I will be the last to know, because it will mark that secret as well. So thank you for listening, and I would like to take any of your questions now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Dana. I want to just lead off because you've made so many references to the National Security Agency tonight and described it as the eavesdropper. Our next speaker in this series is the former director of the National Security Agency and also the former director of the CIA. So I've just got to ask you, set these folks up. If you were on stage right now with General Hayden, Michael Hayden, what would you want to know about what the NSA's budget is, what its global reach is, what part of the billions of dollars, in your view, for having investigated, could or should be cut back? Or what parts of it are doing fantastic work and really ought to be expanded?
Yes, that's exactly what I'd like to know. I mean, we do know that it's more than doubled in size. And you know, because I'm a journalist and I'm always poking at the government, I would probably get right down to the bottom line and ask them the tough question, which is, what about that warrantless wiretapping? You know, why was it necessary to do that? And are you doing it now in some other form?
What are you talking about there?
So a couple years ago, the competitor, the New York Times, wrote a story that
James Risen actually wrote the story, I think, who, by the way, was a previous speaker in this series. But anyway, go ahead.
And is now being hounded by the government for something else he wrote, and is possibly going to have to do some jail time because of it, because he won't disclose his sources, not because he did anything he's being accused of doing any wrongdoing. But they wrote a story about the fact that the government was not seeking legal permission through obtaining warrants to spy on people within the United States who were having conversations with people overseas. And they just said it was too lengthy of a process, so we did it without the legal approval. And when they got caught, they had all sorts of excuses, and General Hayden is very articulate about what those are. And they mainly have to do with how technology had changed the nature of communication, and that they really needed to do this because the legal system was too cumbersome. However, when it got disclosed and there was an uproar about it, they changed it so that it was no longer too cumbersome. And now they say that they are doing it with the legal approvals. The NSA...
So it's still going on?
But not warrantless.
Okay.
It's now has legal approvals to do it. So he ran the agency at a time when it grew from the pre-9/11 listening in on the heads of state to see what they were up to and what their intentions were, to trying to figure out how to attack, how to get in and listen to individuals in a very tight circle with no possibility of informants, planting bugs or anything like that. And along the way, he has at least more than doubled his budget, and the National Security Agency plant is so huge, and they're going to double in size as well. So, if you could get him to talk about where the cuts could come, if you had to cut something, because everyone is aware of our fiscal restraint, where would it be? And I have had people tell me about the 33 different databases that don't talk to each other in the NSA, about programs, Trailblazer is the name of one of them, that wasted billions and billions of dollars, in part because nobody could look at it and say, hey, you're wasting money here. The guy that outed this program actually then got charged with disclosing it to a reporter. The government tried to throw him in prison, but the judge, looking at what he was really giving out, which was not a lot of detail, but the fact that this cost tens of billions of dollars and was getting nowhere, decided that it was more like a public service that he was performing, and that he shouldn't, and dropped most of the charges, and he's free now.
All right, time for your
But good luck.
Okay.
No, and one other thing about him, he's a very competent person, and he's very articulate, and with the media, he was more open than most in this field. After he left government, he became one of the industry people, and now works at a group called the Chertoff Group, headed by Michael Chertoff, who used to be the head of the Department of Homeland Security. And when Michael Chertoff left the department, he raided it of its top management and brought them with him to his company, and then collected a couple other really big names like Michael Hayden. And what they do is they advise investors, big investors, on where to put their money in this intelligence sector. So that is part of how the industry and the complex survives and grows.
All right, let's take some of your questions. We'll follow the global agenda tradition, which is to alternate between questions from students and questions from non-students, and we'll try to get as many in as we can. How about a question from a student? Is there a question from a student? Raise your hand, because I can hardly see in the light. Yes? No? Student? Where? Up top. Would you mind standing up just because we're having a hard time hearing? Thank you.
My understanding is that the American military had about 50 drones September 10th, 2001. Now we have thousands upon thousands flying around the skies. The reports I understand is that there will soon be a fleet of some 10 to 20,000 drones flying over American soil. Is that true? If so, what are the ramifications?
Okay. Questions about unmanned or pilotless aircraft called drones that are used for espionage and other purposes. The questioner is asking about the extent of the drone fleet used outside the U.S., and is there one inside the U.S., and how big is it?
Okay. Well, you're right. Before 9/11, we had just a handful of drones, and the Air Force, which developed them, hated them because it meant the pilots wouldn't have a job. And so they used to just despair on the drones until the CIA, which was at 9/11 much more ahead of the military in having a plan to do something about Al-Qaeda, used drones first in a surveillance way, mounting cameras on them that could look down below, but then armed them with missiles and began killing people in a way that wouldn't require many people on the ground. So we did go from about having 50 drones in the arsenal to about 6,000. And many of those 6,000 are experimental. They're small things that look like hummingbirds. or other kind of insects. There's one that looks like a dragonfly. It's the armed ones that are, of course, of most concern. What you're talking about domestically is the request by various government agencies to be able to fly drones over U.S. airspace. And those would not be the armed drones. In fact, knowing how sensitive, that would be and how people would generally not like that, they have explicitly said these will be unarmed drones. But the skeptics, let's call them, would say this is a slippery slope. And that on the Mexican border, for instance, where there are lots of people on the ground trying to stop the drug people from coming across the border, or armed people, there have been unarmed drones that have been used there, but there is a push by certain elements within the government to begin at some point using armed drones. And I can see that happening. So right now, it's mainly for training purposes, but I think that eventually, in the near future, we will have fleets of surveillance drones over the United States, and I will be very surprised if we have armed drones in the United States.
Are they all government operated at this time, and do you anticipate that remaining the case, or considering your description of how the non-government contractor world of intelligence has grown, could you envision this also being outsourced to non-government control?
Well, the drones will be under the management of the government, but even today in the wars overseas, contractors do everything except pull the trigger. So that means, and I've had actually conflicting stories about whether there are a couple of contractors that have fired the drone missiles. So right now, it is contractors build them, they are overseas to maintain them, they even fly them on takeoff and landing until they get into the box, the combat zone, wherever that is, and in which case they hand over the joystick, because it's really like a joystick on a video game, to a pilot in a uniform sitting next to them, unless it's a CIA person, and then they hand it over to them, and they pull the trigger. They push the button that launches the missile. And so far, it's not a contractor that does that, but people do believe that it might get to that point someday. Okay. And we're selling drones to foreign countries for use in surveillance. I think the UAE, and other countries in the Middle East.
All right, we'll come back to that in a minute. Question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
Is it fair to say that covert operations generally is required to and does obey U.S. law, but no such expectation in any other country?
Question is it fair to say that U.S. covert operations follow U.S. law, but do not necessarily follow the law of other countries in which they're operating?
Yes, that's how it's supposed to work. They aren't, they certainly aren't allowed to do covert operations within the United States, but they aren't allowed to break the laws of the United States when they're here. But overseas, the whole reason that covert operations exist is really to do things that no other branch, unit of government is allowed to do. And so the military, is not allowed to bribe people in order to get secrets about a government, but the CIA is. It used to be that the military was not allowed to kill people, and the CIA was. The interpretation by the lawyers in the White House was that that is legal under this war, because it's a defensive act against people who are actively plotting to destroy the United States. And that's the legal justification that remains, at least as far as I know, remains on the secret books today. So when in the beginning it was only that the CIA could do this under a covert operation, which requires, because of the abuses of the past, it requires the president to sign something called a finding, a presidential finding that goes to Congress, so that Congress can know that the executive is doing this very sensitive thing. Well, now these very secretive JSOC troops are also doing the exact same thing without a presidential finding, and they're calling it a traditional military operation, which their lawyers say is legal under the rules that the military operate under. And this is where there are a lot of questions because of the way this has gravitated into something that looks exactly like a covert operation. And yet it doesn't have the presidential finding and the congressional oversight that the CIA has.
Dan, I think I mentioned, and our audience knows, that this program is being carried on the internet through Second Life, and we have some viewers watching there, and one of them is asking you whether your analysis of the military intelligence complex in the United States is having any effect on other countries. Are you seeing, or are you able to comment on whether you're seeing similar developments in places like China or Russia that also have intelligence complexes? Are they also outsourcing to private contractors? And is there any connection between what they're doing and what the private contractors in the US are doing, such as trading or selling technology and so on?
Well, I wouldn't use China because, you know, most all of it is state-run, and I wouldn't, and I don't really know about the answer to Russia, but I would say that other countries in the Middle East in particular, and then in
Israel?
Well, you know, Israel has its own very sophisticated and elaborate intelligence world that many of our people went and sought help from after 9/11, because some of what we're doing now mimics what the Israelis have been doing for a long time, which is targeting individuals. In the Israeli case, after the Olympiads were murdered in 1972, thank you, and the Israelis went after all the people that were responsible one by one over many years, they used the kind of intelligence gathering and analysis and targeting that we are using actually more in a more sophisticated way we are now doing. So this idea that it's okay to kill an individual, you know, is not a new practice, but it's a new practice for us. But in the other way, our allies in Europe have in no way spent as much money as we have, but they have been cooperating a lot more with us, as have other allies outside of Europe, in part because we have so much information and they have so much information, and together it's really powerful and actually can find people, and without that cooperation it's much more difficult to find people. And that's meant linking up to our systems in a way that they didn't before. And we have set up, the CIA has set up in various countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, Yemen, these collective centers where you have people from the country, the host country, and the CIA sitting down together. And in Europe, they did this in order to get around the laws of Germany. Because in Germany, the local police and the intelligence, and the national police or the intelligence police were not allowed to share information, and part of it stems from their history. So that meant the local police that knew of terrorist cells could not get it to the national level to be used by intelligence services. And so they created a base in Paris, actually, in which people from Germany sat as representatives from those two German places that weren't allowed to talk to each other, and they talked to the base. And so it was a workaround on the laws that existed on the German books.
Okay, question from a student. Yes, sir.
How the U.S. deal with how the United States deal with foreign policy, like other countries like Europe, Asia, Canada, and Mexico?
Foreign policy generally?
Yep.
Okay, it's a pretty general question.
Well, okay, the thing I've learned about that question is that it deals in it in a different way than you and I usually see. Getting into this world and opening it up a little bit, I really realized that there are multiple layers of reality. There's what you and I see, which is largely brought to us by the media and our access to diplomacy and by, you know, the official press conferences and that sort of thing. And then there's the diplomatic level right below that, which is supposed to be usually confidential, but we hear a lot about it. And then there's a couple layers below that of secrecy. And that's where the real story happens. And it's rarely what we see. So, you know, when I look at a place like Iran now, the one thing I know for certain is I have no clue what's going on. And what I'm reading in the newspaper is just a sliver of the truth. And whether or not we'll ever be able to get to the truth, you know, is unknown, at least for now. You know, history, we often can go back and look at what happened. But it's not a great message, because I try very hard to, as a reporter, and most reporters do, to, you know, illuminate what's going on in our government. But we deal at such different levels. And the other truth is that no matter what happens at these other levels, but in the intelligence level, things more or less remain calm. So when Donald Rumsfeld was yelling at the French for being the French, and the Congress was saying, we're going to rename French fries to freedom fries because these guys won't join us, what was really happening at that level was huge cooperation on the part of the French and the Americans and the other Europeans. But because there was this hoopla on the outside, I found the French story all the more interesting. The French were really giving the Americans a lot of information that helped unmask, you know, financing pipelines and other terrorist-related things. And down here, they, you know, roll their eyes at what's going on over there and continue on.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
Non-student.
Following the 9/11 attacks, the government, as it frequently does, appointed a commission headed by former New Jersey Governor Tom Kean, and that commission really studied why our intelligence system couldn't protect us, and it made some very specific recommendations. And I'd like your comments on, within the first year after the commission report, how many, if any, of those were implemented? And since after the first year until now, which is now 10 years later, has anybody paid any attention or done anything to implement anything?
Okay, question is about the 9/11 Commission that was headed by Tom Kean, but also co-chaired by Lee Hamilton, who was another previous speaker at this, in this series. Question to you is, how many of the recommendations after 9/11 were implemented in the short term, and here we are 10, 11 years later, how many of those recommendations have been implemented?
Well, that commission, you know, really did dig deeply, and there were dozens and dozens of recommendations. And I would say, this is a rough estimate, but at least half of them were seriously considered. And their main concern was that the agencies were so isolated from one another for various reasons, none of which were good, that they needed to be able to talk to each other. And if whatever the obstacles to doing that were, they needed to get rid of those obstacles. And one of their ideas was to create this, the Director of National Intelligence, to make them do that. Then it got into the political hands, who needed to fund it and set it up, and they said, yeah, we like that idea. And the 9/11 families had a huge part in this. They too said, our government failed, therefore we have to make it look different. We need another agency. We can't just depend on the CIA and the FBI. And so they were very much a motivator for President Bush and Congress to back this idea that you needed someone else on top of it all. But I think that they did not envision that this thing that was put on top would be toothless. And in fact, they're very upfront about that. And they don't think, while there have been strides, some of those barriers to sharing are gone, like the legal barriers are gone. The cultural barriers, they are lessened, but they still remain. And that's almost the nature of bureaucracy, because you know, it is like a tribal system here in the United States, where you have the FBI and the CIA. They grow up in different cultures. They have different laws. The personalities of those people are different, and they're molded by those laws and traditions. And so not only do they sometimes clash because of that, but then they have the, you know, the old-fashioned bureaucratic, who gets what pot of money, who gets control over X. And so that's why, in the last thing I was saying, which was we have killed or captured most of Al-Qaeda, and we have a much better sense of where the threats are now. The reason is because people working together in smaller groups, but of different agencies coming together, that really did work. It's when it gets removed from the operations level, you know, the how do we find them, what do we do about it? When it comes up to the bureaucratic level, things just fall apart. And yeah, they all sit together in this giant building, but what do they really do? In fact, that building has no operational authority. It doesn't tell anybody to go and do anything. That gets done elsewhere. So I think they gave the government a D, is my recollection. When the commission came back together and looked at, this was maybe 2 years ago, they didn't give it high marks, and said that a lot of problems still remained. So I think that we can look back on that commission, you know, 20 years from now and probably still learn a lot of things about how government didn't work at the time.
Dan, I don't know if you can answer this question or if you'd want to, but you've talked about technology a lot, eavesdropping and drones and so on, and you've talked about bureaucracy a lot. What role in today's intelligence world does human intelligence play? Is it an old-fashioned method that's not terribly useful anymore? In the grand scheme of things that you've observed, what role does it play? And what are we talking about when we say human intelligence today?
So it's called, if you want to be in the know, it's called human intelligence. It means people with information. and it's critical to unearthing, you know, where terrorist networks in particular operate and how they operate, because unlike state actors, they tend to be very isolated and very small. And so it's very difficult to find them, and it's very difficult to get information out of them. And so human intelligence in particular countries where these problems exist is very critical to figuring out where to point your surveillance drone. And that's why the relationship, it's called the liaison relationship, the relationship that the CIA and our other intelligence agencies have with foreign intelligence services has become so important, because it's those services that are more likely to get the human intelligence, the informant, you know, the disillusioned Al-Qaeda member or the disillusioned Islamic scholar who now sees people around him talking about not Islam, but something very destructive, who might inform on those people. And so it is, however, the hardest thing to do, because you do need people who are willing to risk a lot and to go against potentially their own personal interests. Money doesn't seem to work in the same way it did during the Cold War, when we could recruit people using money. Or another biggie was education for their children or healthcare for their family members. Those were the three big reasons that ways that we could turn Soviet spies and others in the East Bloc and elsewhere to our advantage, was using those. So The money doesn't seem to be as big a factor, and then infiltrating using our own people seems nearly impossible.
Let's go for a question from a student. Yes.
Cybersecurity breaches by groups such as like Anonymous. What do you think that future holds by government bodies or moves will be with regard to moving from human intelligence to digital electronic intelligence? And what do you think how it will affect the average citizens?
Okay, questions about cyber security, intelligence, and attacks using computer and digital technologies. The question basically is, I'll broaden it to how big a role is that playing today in threatening the United States, and how will it be used by the United States in the future as a counter terrorist or counter threat?
And how's it
situation?
affecting
And how does it affect ordinary
us?
Americans?
That's a big question. So it's it's a thing that all government officials now talk a lot about is the insecurity of cyber. And what that means is the insecurity or the vulnerability of sensitive information getting into the wrong hands. The weird phenomenon that's happening now is that you have these two parallel universes, which I write about in the last chapter of the book that's out there called Top Secret America. One is that after 9/11, this big classification wall came down and so much is classified now. Meanwhile, in private industry, the technological advances have actually made getting a hold of things like secrets a lot easier, because the equipment is there to do it, and the managers of this thing over here, the government cyberspace, are my generation and older, and they don't understand, largely, what this is all about. So that's why, if Brian Manning did what he's accused of doing and downloaded hundreds of thousands of secret cables and then gave them to WikiLeaks, he was able to do that in part because the people who managed his workspace must not have realized that you could take a simple thumb drive, put it in the computer, and that network was not at all protected, and it would be that easy to do. And the truth is they didn't realize that. And it's not because, and it's because they're dumb in that way. It is generational. And so the managers of government who tend to be my age and older are trying to keep up and trying to hire younger people who will explain this world and protect them from it. On the other hand, they know it's like sticking your finger in the dike, because there are so many government systems now, and there are so many different ways to get into them. And so I visited, I'll tell you this one story that helped me, who's a dummy in this area, illustrate this problem. I visited this company called Taversa outside of Pittsburgh in order to do this last chapter. And what they do is they sell themselves to large law firms and corporations who know that they have some of their proprietary information out there on the web somewhere. Usually it's because an employee has taken work home, has downloaded it onto a computer that their kid is also hooked up to, and the kid has put file sharing, he's put a software onto the computer in order to share songs with one another. But what that is doing is it's like opening your front door so that anybody who goes down your street and sees that your front door is open can come in and go into any room and go into your underwear drawer and take out that stuff. So file sharing software allows strangers to go into your computer and take whatever you have in your files. And that has resulted in a lot of proprietary information floating around that shouldn't be, but also a lot of classified information. So these guys, in their hunt for their clients, they come upon classified information and they call up the government agency just as because they're good citizens, not because this isn't their job. And they say, "Excuse me, but I found the blueprints for Marine One," which is true. And there are people who have nothing better to do in this world than to troll the neighborhoods for open doors and then suck all this out. And if they look at it and there's something interesting, they put it out there for other people to see. And I mean, he showed me, the guy that I sat down at a computer with one of these guys, and he showed me some of the documents that were out there that are unbelievable. I mean, not only like that, but there was it looked like the skeleton of one of the entire classified computer networks that the government runs, and then all the places along the system that you could enter. There were all of the, I won't say who it is, but it's a high-ranking person in our economic policy departments. It was a memo that his secretary wrote to the new secretary that gave all the code name, all the passwords to every bank account, every account he had. Talk about blackmail material. So anyway, it's just to say that this one universe is steaming ahead, flinging open the doors of everything they can get their hands open, and then having fun with it by making it public, like anonymous, or hacking into its perceived enemies and embarrassing them by making it public. Meanwhile, the government going about trying to figure out how to close all these doors. So it's basically a losing battle, I think, for the government side. And what I think really smart people in that business believe is that it's time to really figure out what secrets need to be kept and to really work hard to keep those secret. And our laws on secrets were written long ago when technology wasn't moving at this speed, and when it really did matter if a particular technology was exposed because it took so long to invent it, and there's no way you can build another something like that. And today that's just not the case, because we're dealing with the kind of technology we're dealing with, and the pace of change is so fast that if something were to get out, the chances that the government would find another way to work around it are very high. They do it all the time when the enemy adapts. Once Al-Qaeda, learned not to use cell phones, which I would imagine would be very quick, then the government learned, that was a bad thing, but they learned how to deal with it by finding ways, I'll just say compensating and doing other things that made it easy to pinpoint people. So technology is changing so much that the old rules about secrecy are really antiquated and are now overburdening a government that really does need to keep some things secret.
Let's take a last question from a non-student. In the back. All right, we'll do that.
Okay, so working with military intelligence complex employees, any thoughts on how many threats against the United States have been discovered and why were they disappeared?
How many threats have been discovered, and the last part?
And why were they disappeared?
Okay. Can you, the question is, with all of the complex that you described, are there threats that have been discovered and quietly been made to disappear? In other words, are there things we don't know about that we might have been threatened by or endangered by?
Well, I'm sure there must be, but this is a question that, any intelligence reporter, any FBI reporter has been asking every day since 9/11. Because at first, we thought there were so many of them, and then, nothing happened, and then even the government has to justify, its spending and its new programs, and so I don't know if there are, I guess that there would be, because just the chances are that there have been. What I'm talking about are things, people or threats that made it into the U.S., because certainly there are, we know of cases outside the U.S. where people have been picked up or killed because they were actively plotting against the United States, and we report on those. Alaki is the latest case someone who was born here, very potentially dangerous because they're an English speaker, and we're recruiting English speakers that would be harder to detect because they're English speakers, and went from, in their judgment, a pontificator and inspirational speaker to someone who actively plotted operations against the United States, at which point got him on the kill list. But inside the United States, we haven't heard of anything. I haven't heard of anything, but I'm sure it's got to be out there. Now, how much of it is out there is really an interesting question. No one, because I think, and this is like my closing of the book, and it's my closing, I think, like here is the closing thought, is none of this spending or overspending or misdirected spending and effort will stop, I think, until we can have a realistic conversation about terrorism here. Right now, if you're a political leader, you are not going to score any points if you say, is this too much? In fact, you're probably going to get hammered. And that includes by the media. If something happens, if a lone crazy person tries to kill somebody and calls themselves a terrorist, we are going to say, how come you didn't find him? We have an unrealistic view of terrorism. We don't have that in any other kind of crime. So why do we have an unrealistic view? I think it's because we've not had an honest discussion about it. The government will not say really how much progress they've made, how the threat has changed from this to, this, and we see most of that. We're not going to see it all. We probably will miss some things will happen, but we've got a much better view of it. And for us as the public to accept that there's going to be some mistakes and there's going to be some things that slip through. So if we're not willing to have that discussion in a thoughtful way, then we're just going to continue down this line where we hold them to a no-fault policy, and because of it, more is always going to be the answer to every problem.
A reminder that tonight in the lobby, Dana Priest will be glad to autograph copies of her new book called Top Secret America. Please take advantage of the opportunity on your way out. Before we say thanks to Dana, allow me to preview what's ahead. On March 14th, 2 weeks from tonight, we're honored to have with us General Michael Hayden, who, serving under 2 U.S. presidents, headed the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, the 2 top intelligence and espionage agencies of the United States government. And ahead, with other speakers, we'll touch on virtually every topic Dana talked about tonight. Human intelligence, with a CIA official who trained human counterintelligence officials at the farm. We have an agent coming who challenges the CIA's normal assumptions and plays part of the red cell, sort of the opposition, the mock opposition. We'll have an expert on cyber intelligence as well in this program. So go to the website, check out the future speakers, and we look forward to seeing you here. To be sure you don't miss announcements of our programs in the future, get on the list. On your way out tonight, after picking up a copy of Dana's book, please clearly print your email address on one of the bright orange sheets out in the lobby. Now, let's please thank our speaker tonight, Dana. Please,